The sun hung mercilessly over Broken Creek, Dakota Territory, casting long shadows across the dusty main street where tumbleweeds danced in the afternoon heat. It was September 1876, and the small frontier town buzzed with the nervous energy that always accompanied the arrival of the railroad surveyors. Progress, they called it, though to many it felt more like an invasion. Eleanor Ellie Whitmore pressed her back against the rough wooden planks of Murphy's Saloon, her wrists raw from the iron shackles that bound her to the hitching post. The metal had grown hot under the relentless sun, and she could feel the burn through her torn cotton dress. Her auburn hair, once neatly pinned in the fashion expected of a schoolteacher, now hung in damp strands around her face, framing green eyes that burned with undiminished defiance. "Water," she croaked to a passing cowhand, her voice barely audible above the clatter of horse hooves and wagon wheels. The man averted his gaze and quickened his pace, as if her condition were somehow contagious. This was the fourth person to ignore her plea in the past hour. The town of Broken Creek had grown around the confluence of two streams, its wooden buildings stretching along the muddy main thoroughfare like crooked teeth. The saloon behind her was the largest structure, its false front painted a garish red that had faded to the color of dried blood. Across the street, the general store displayed bolts of fabric and farming tools in its window, while the blacksmith's hammer rang out its steady rhythm from the shop next door. Ellie had been chained here for 6 hours now since dawn, as punishment for what Mayor Cornelius Thorne called inciting rebellion among the womenfolk. Her crime had been teaching the wives and daughters of the town to read, not just recipes and Bible verses, but newspapers, legal documents, and books that spoke of women's rights and freedoms. When she'd refused to cease her lessons despite repeated warnings, the town council had voted to make an example of her. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was being punished beside Murphy's Saloon, where men gathered nightly to drink away their wages, while their wives struggled to make ends meet. The establishment's owner, Sean Murphy, had been one of the loudest voices calling for her punishment, claiming that educated women were unnatural and threatened the God-given order of things. A group of children had gathered at the corner, whispering and pointing before their mothers hurried them away. Ellie recognized several of her former students among them: Mary Henderson, whose reading had improved dramatically over the summer, and little Sarah Collins, who had shown such promise with arithmetic. Their mothers' faces were masks of conflicted emotion, torn between sympathy for their teacher and fear of their husband's reactions. "Shameful display," muttered Mrs. Agatha Thornton, the mayor's wife, as she passed with her shopping basket. A woman should know her place. But Ellie caught the quick, worried glance the older woman threw in her direction, and the way her steps faltered slightly, as if she wanted to stop, but didn't dare. The heat was becoming unbearable. Ellie's throat felt like sandpaper, and her head pounded with each heartbeat. She had eaten nothing since yesterday evening, when Deputy Marshal Jake Morrison had come to arrest her at the schoolhouse. He'd been apologetic but firm, explaining that he had no choice but to follow the town council's orders. "It's not right, Miss Whitmore," he'd said, his weathered face creased with concern. "But Mayor Thorne's got the backing of the territorial government. Says you're causing social unrest." Social unrest. The phrase would have been laughable if the situation weren't so dire. All she had done was teach women to read beyond their station, to question the documents their husbands brought home, to understand the legal rights they possessed but were never told about. In her evening classes, held in the back room of the abandoned church, she had watched women's faces transform as they discovered the power of knowledge. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon when Ellie heard the sound of approaching hooves. Different from the usual traffic, these were unshod horses, moving with a rhythm that spoke of riders who had learned to move with their mounts rather than against them. She lifted her head, squinting through the heat haze. 3 riders approached from the east, their silhouettes wavering in the afternoon heat. As they drew closer, Ellie could make out their features more clearly. They were Native Americans, likely Lakota from their clothing and bearing. The lead rider was a young man, perhaps in his mid-20s, with long black hair adorned with a single eagle feather. His face was angular and weathered by sun and wind, his dark eyes intelligent and alert. The town's mood shifted instantly. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Shopkeepers moved to their windows, and several men stepped out of the saloon behind her. The tension was palpable. Relations between the town and the nearby Lakota bands had been strained since the recent conflicts at Little Bighorn. Every encounter carried the potential for violence. The 3 riders dismounted in front of the general store, their movements fluid and purposeful. The young man in the lead glanced around the street, taking in the faces of the white settlers with calm assessment. His gaze lingered on Ellie, chained to the post, and something shifted in his expression, a flicker of recognition or understanding. "We come to trade," he announced in clear English, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet street. "We have furs, beadwork. We need supplies for winter." Mayor Thorne emerged from his office, flanked by two armed men. He was a portly man with thinning hair and small calculating eyes that seemed to evaluate everything in terms of profit and loss. "This is a civilized town," he declared, his voice pitched loud enough for everyone to hear. "We don't need your kind causing trouble." The young Lakota's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but his voice remained steady. "We make no trouble. We trade honest goods for honest supplies." "Honest?" Mayor Thorne's voice rose. "After what your people did to Custer, after the raids on settlements, we were not at Little Bighorn," the young man replied calmly. "We hunt, we trade, we seek only to survive the winter that comes." The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring. Ellie could feel the violence simmering just beneath the surface, the way it always did when fear and prejudice collided with dignity and desperation. She had seen this dance before, in other towns, other territories. It usually ended badly for everyone involved. The young Lakota's eyes found hers again, and this time he stepped closer, studying her situation with careful attention. The chains, the positioning beside the saloon, the way the townspeople averted their gazes, it all told a story that needed no translation. "Why is the white woman bound?" he asked Mayor Thorne, his voice carefully neutral. "That's none of your concern," Thorne snapped. "She's being punished for disturbing the peace." The young man's companions exchanged glances, and one of them, an older man with gray streaking his braids, said something in Lakota. The young warrior nodded slowly, then addressed the mayor again. "She's a teacher, yes? The children speak of her kindness." This surprised Ellie. How would Lakota children know of her? But then she remembered the mixed-blood children who sometimes appeared at the edge of town, watching her classes through the windows. She'd always wondered about them, had even left food on the windowsill on cold days. She was teaching things she shouldn't, Mayor Thorne said, his face reddening, putting ideas in women's heads that they don't need. The young Lakota studied Ellie's face for a long moment, and she saw something there, a recognition of shared struggle, perhaps, or simply human compassion. When he spoke again, his voice was quiet, but carried clearly in the still air. "In my people's way, knowledge is sacred. To punish one who shares knowledge is to punish the future itself." The crowd was growing restless. Several men had drifted closer, their hands resting on gun butts. The situation was escalating beyond anyone's control, and Ellie found herself caught in the middle of forces much larger than her small rebellion. The young warrior stepped closer to her, close enough that she could see the fine beadwork on his leather vest, the careful way he moved to avoid seeming threatening while still maintaining his dignity. Up close, his face was younger than she had first thought, but his eyes held the weight of someone who had seen too much violence, too much loss. "What is your name?" he asked her quietly. "Eleanor Whitmore," she replied, her voice stronger than she felt. "And yours?" "Dakota," he said. "It means friend to all." The irony of the name wasn't lost on either of them, standing as they were in the middle of a town that saw him as nothing but a threat. But there was something in his voice, in the way he looked at her, that suggested he took the meaning of his name seriously. Mayor Thorne stepped forward, his patience clearly at an end. "This conversation is over. You've done your trading, now move along." "We have done no trading," Dakota replied evenly, "but perhaps that is for the best." He turned to go, but something made him pause. Perhaps it was the way the late afternoon sun caught the raw marks around Ellie's wrists, or the resignation he saw creeping into her eyes, or perhaps it was simply that he recognized injustice when he saw it, regardless of the color of the skin it wore. The evening air brought little relief from the heat, as shadows lengthened across Broken Creek's main street. Ellie's legs had long since given out, and she now sat slumped against the hitching post, her wrists bearing the full weight of the iron shackles. The metal had rubbed her skin raw, and she could feel the warm trickle of blood mixing with the dust on her arms. Dakota and his companions had retreated to the shade of the general store's overhang, ostensibly to examine the goods displayed in the window, but Ellie noticed how the young warrior's eyes kept drifting back to her. The older man with him, whom she'd heard called Chayton, spoke in low, urgent tones, clearly advocating for their departure. The third member of their group, a lean man with a prominent scar across his left cheek, simply watched the townspeople with the alert stillness of a predator. "They should leave," muttered Tom Bradley, the blacksmith, as he emerged from his shop, wiping his hands on a leather apron. "Nothing good comes from Indians lingering in town." His words carried in the still air, and Ellie saw Dakota's jaw tighten slightly. The young Lakota understood English far better than most of the townspeople realized, she suspected. It was a useful skill in a world where information often meant survival. As the sun sank lower, more men began to gather outside Murphy's saloon. The evening crowd was always rowdier, fueled by whiskey and the day's frustrations. Ellie had seen this pattern before in other frontier towns, alcohol, fear, and prejudice combining into something dangerous and unpredictable. Sean Murphy himself appeared in the saloon's doorway, his massive frame filling the entrance. He was a man who had built his fortune on the weaknesses of others, selling liquid courage to men who needed it, to face another day in the harsh territory. His pale blue eyes swept the street, taking in the three Lakota with obvious displeasure. "Closing time for trade," he announced loudly, though the sun was still visible above the horizon. "Time for visitors to move along." Chayton placed a hand on Dakota's shoulder, speaking quietly in their native tongue. Ellie caught fragments, words of caution, references to the approaching darkness, and what sounded like concern for the horses. The older man's wisdom was clear. They had accomplished nothing here, and staying longer would only invite trouble. But Dakota shook his head, his gaze fixed on Ellie. There was something in his expression that reminded her of her younger brother back in Ohio, the same stubborn set to his jaw when he'd decided something was wrong and needed to be made right. It was a look that had gotten Thomas into more fights than their mother could count. "Water," Ellie whispered, her voice barely audible. Her throat felt like it was closing, and the world seemed to shimmer at the edges. She had been without food or water for nearly 24 hours now, and the heat had sapped what little strength she had left. Dakota heard her. He stepped away from his companions and walked to the water trough beside the general store. The townspeople watched his every movement with suspicious eyes as he cupped his hands and approached her. "That's enough." Mayor Thorne's voice cut through the evening air like a whip crack. He had emerged from his office with Deputy Marshal Morrison at his side, both men's hands resting on their weapons. "Step away from the prisoner." Dakota paused, water dripping between his fingers. "She dies of thirst," he said simply. "This is not justice." "Justice is what we decide it is in this town," Thorne replied, his chest puffing out with self-importance. "And we don't need savages telling us how to handle our own affairs." The word hung in the air like a slap. Ellie saw the way Dakota's companions tensed, their hands moving almost imperceptibly toward their weapons. The scar-faced man took a step forward, his dark eyes fixed on the mayor with unmistakable hostility, but Dakota remained calm, though she could see the effort it cost him. "I am not savage," he said quietly. "I am man who sees suffering and wishes to ease it. Is this not what your Jesus taught?" The reference to Christianity caught Mayor Thorne off guard. Like many frontier politicians, he used religion as a tool of control rather than genuine faith, and having it turned back on him by a heathen was clearly unsettling. "Don't you dare quote scripture at me," Thorne sputtered, his face reddening. "Your kind knows nothing of Christian charity." Dakota's response was to slowly, deliberately pour the water he held into his mouth, then walk back to the trough for more. This time, he didn't hesitate. He moved to Ellie's side, and ignoring the shouted protests from the growing crowd, knelt beside her. "Small sips," he said softly, supporting her head as he helped her drink. The water was warm and tasted of metal, but it was the sweetest thing she had ever experienced. Too much too fast will make you sick. Up close, she could see the fine details of his appearance, the careful way his hair was braided with small strips of leather, the silver and turquoise bracelet around his wrist, the small medicine bag that hung from his belt. But it was his eyes that struck her most. They were dark and intelligent, but also kind in a way that seemed at odds with the harsh world he inhabited. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice still hoarse but stronger than before. He nodded, then stood to face the crowd that was rapidly becoming a mob. Deputy Marshal Morrison had his hand on his gun, but his face showed reluctance. He was a fair man caught between duty and conscience, and the conflict was written clearly in his weathered features. "You need to leave," Morrison said, his voice carrying the weight of authority, but also genuine concern. "Now, before this gets out of hand." Dakota looked around at the assembled townspeople, farmers, shopkeepers, drifters, and working men, all united in their suspicion and anger. He had seen this before in other towns, other territories. Fear had a way of turning ordinary people into something dangerous and unpredictable. "I go," he said finally. "But first, I speak truth." He turned to address the crowd. his voice carrying clearly in the still evening air. "You chain woman for teaching. You call this justice, but I see fear. Fear of wisdom, fear of change, fear of what women might become if they learn to read your laws." "Shut your mouth," Sean Murphy growled, stepping forward from the saloon entrance. "We don't need lectures from redskins about our laws." "Your laws," Dakota repeated, his tone thoughtful. "Yes, I read them. Treaty of 1851, Treaty of 1868. Many promises, all broken. But still I come to trade, still I try to live in peace." The crowd was growing restless, and Ellie could feel the violence building like pressure before a storm. She had seen lynch mobs before, had witnessed how quickly civilized men could become animals when they felt their worldview threatened. "Dakota," she said, his name feeling strange on her tongue. "Please, just go." He looked down at her, and she saw something shift in his expression. "You ask me to leave you to die? I ask you to live," she replied, surprised by the strength in her own voice. "Your people need you alive, not dead, in a pointless fight." Chaitan had moved closer, and now he spoke urgently in Lakota. The words were rapid, clipped, clearly a warning about the deteriorating situation. The third man, whom Ellie had heard called Mato, had positioned himself to watch the crowd's flanks, his hand resting on the knife at his belt. But Dakota seemed frozen by some internal struggle. Everything about his posture spoke of a man torn between wisdom and conscience, between the practical need to survive and the moral imperative to act against injustice. "My grandmother," he said suddenly, his voice quiet but carrying to the crowd, "she taught me that knowledge is like water. It must flow or it becomes poison. You poison your own well by chaining those who would share wisdom." Mayor Thorne had had enough. "Morrison, arrest that Indian for disturbing the peace." The deputy marshal's hand tightened on his gun, but his feet remained planted. "He's done nothing illegal, Mayor. Giving water to a prisoner isn't a crime." "He's inciting unrest," Thorne insisted. "Look at the crowd. They're ready to riot." It was true. The men outside the saloon were growing more agitated by the moment, fed by alcohol and the peculiar rage that came when their assumptions about the world were challenged. Ellie could see it in their faces, the desire to strike out at something, anything, to make themselves feel powerful again. Dakota seemed to sense it too. He took a step back from Ellie, his hands visible and empty, but his eyes never left the crowd. "I have said my piece," he announced. "Now I go in peace." But as he turned to leave, old Jake Henley stumbled out of the saloon, whiskey heavy on his breath and hatred thick in his voice. "Not so fast, you red bastard," he slurred. "You think you can come into our town and tell us what's what?" Henley was a broken man, a former soldier who had lost his leg at Gettysburg and his family to cholera. The bottle had become his only companion, and with it came the bitter need to blame someone else for his pain. Tonight, that someone was Dakota. The old soldier swayed toward the young Lakota, his remaining good hand fumbling for the pistol at his hip. "You want to save the schoolma'am? Then you can join her." The crowd fell silent. Even the cicadas seemed to stop their evening chorus. Everything balanced on a knife's edge, and Ellie knew that in the next few moments someone would die. Time seemed suspended in that moment before violence erupts, when the world holds its breath and every soul present knows that lives are about to change forever. Jake Henley's weathered hand trembled as he pulled his Colt .45 from its holster, the metal catching the last rays of sunlight like a promise of death. Dakota stood perfectly still, his dark eyes fixed on the old soldier with the calm acceptance of a man who had faced death before. His companions, however, were not so passive. Chaitan's hand moved to his tomahawk while Mato shifted position to flank the crowd, his scarred face set in grim determination. "Jake, put the gun down," Deputy Marshal Morrison said, his voice steady but urgent. "You're drunk and you're about to do something you can't take back." But Henley was beyond reason, lost in the bitter fog of alcohol and old wounds. "Damn Indian thinks he can waltz into our town and tell us how to live," he slurred, the gun wavering in his grip. "Well, I got news for him. We don't take orders from savages." Ellie watched the scene unfold with growing horror. She had become the catalyst for something that would likely end in bloodshed, and the weight of that responsibility pressed down on her like a physical burden. From her position chained to the hitching post, she could see the faces of the townspeople, some eager for violence, others clearly uncomfortable with how far things had escalated. "Please," she called out, her voice cracking with exhaustion and desperation. "Stop this. No one needs to die over me." Her words seemed to break through Jake's alcoholic haze for a moment. He looked at her, confusion flickering across his weathered features. "You're defending him?" he asked, incredulous. "This redskin?" "I'm defending human decency." Ellie replied, finding strength she didn't know she possessed. Something this town seems to have forgotten. The insult hit home. Several men in the crowd shifted angrily, and Sean Murphy stepped forward from the saloon entrance, his massive frame casting a long shadow across the dusty street. "That's enough lip from you, schoolmarm," Murphy growled. "You've caused enough trouble for one day." But Dakota had heard something in Ellie's voice, a recognition of shared humanity that transcended the artificial boundaries of race and culture. He stepped forward, not away from the gun, but toward it, his movements slow and deliberate. "Old soldier," he said, his voice carrying a note of respect, "I see your pain. I know what war does to a man's soul." Henley's hand steadied slightly, surprised by the unexpected compassion in the young Lakota's tone. "You don't know nothing about war," he muttered, but with less conviction than before. "I know that 3 summers ago, my brother died fighting your soldiers at the Rosebud," Dakota replied quietly. "I know that my sister's husband fell at Little Bighorn. I know that my people die, your people die, and still we are told to hate each other." The crowd was listening now, drawn in despite themselves by the young man's words. Even Mayor Thorne seemed momentarily taken aback by this display of humanity from someone he had dismissed as a savage. "But today," Dakota continued, his eyes never leaving Henley's face, "today I choose to see you as a man who has suffered, not as my enemy. Can you do the same?" For a moment it seemed as if the old soldier might lower his weapon. His face worked through a complex array of emotions, confusion, anger, pain, and something that might have been hope. But then someone in the crowd called out, "Don't listen to him, Jake. He's just trying to confuse you." The spell was broken. Henley's face hardened again and his finger tightened on the trigger. "Nice try, Indian, but I ain't fooled by your fancy words." What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. Henley's finger squeezed the trigger. The hammer began to fall and Dakota tensed to dive aside. But before the shot could ring out, Deputy Marshal Morrison's hand clamped down on the old soldier's wrist, forcing the gun skyward. The .45 discharged with a deafening crack, the bullet sailing harmlessly into the evening sky. Henley struggled briefly, but the whiskey had sapped his strength, and Morrison easily wrested the weapon away. "That's enough," Morrison declared, his voice carrying the authority of his office. "Jake, you're under arrest for disturbing the peace and threatening a citizen." "Citizen?" Mayor Thorne sputtered. "That Indian's no citizen. He's a human being on American soil who hasn't broken any laws," Morrison replied firmly. "And last I checked, attempted murder was still a crime in this territory." The crowd was buzzing with angry murmurs, but the moment of peak violence had passed. Dakota straightened, nodding his thanks to the deputy marshal, while his companions visibly relaxed their fighting stances. But the crisis was far from over. Sean Murphy pushed through the crowd, his face flushed with anger. "You're protecting savages now, Morrison. That's not what we pay you for." "You don't pay me, Murphy," the deputy replied evenly. "The territorial government does, and they expect me to uphold the law, not mob rule." The saloon owner's eyes narrowed dangerously. "The law? What about the law that says criminals should be punished?" He pointed at Ellie, still chained to the post. "She broke our rules and she's paying the price. That's justice." "No," Dakota said, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "That is revenge. Justice would be teaching her to follow better rules, not destroying her for questioning bad ones." The philosophical distinction was lost on most of the crowd, but Ellie understood. Despite their cultural differences, she and this young Lakota warrior shared a fundamental belief in the power of education and the importance of questioning authority. It was a bond that transcended race and tradition. Mayor Thorne had regained his composure and was reasserting his authority. "This discussion is over," he declared. "Morrison, I want those Indians out of town immediately. And I want double patrols tonight in case they try to come back." "They've done nothing wrong," Morrison protested. "They've disrupted the peace and interfered with lawful punishment," Thorne replied. "That's enough to justify removal." Dakota exchanged glances with his companions. Chayton nodded grimly. They had pushed their luck as far as they dared. To stay longer would only invite more violence, and they had families and responsibilities back at their camp. "We go," Dakota said finally. "But first, I make promise." He turned to face Ellie, his dark eyes intense with conviction. "I have seen injustice today. I have seen courage. I will not forget either." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of an oath. Ellie felt something stir in her chest. Not hope exactly, but something close to it. For the first time since her ordeal began, she felt that someone truly understood what she was enduring. "Thank you," she whispered, the words carrying more meaning than their simplicity suggested. Dakota nodded, then turned to collect his companions. But as they moved toward their horses, Mayor Thorne called out one final challenge. "Don't think about coming back," he warned. "This town has no place for Indian sympathizers or troublemakers." The young Lakota paused, looking back over his shoulder. "Your town, maybe, but this is still our land. We will come and go as we please." It was a bold statement, and a dangerous one. The crowd stirred restlessly, and several hands moved toward weapons, but Dakota's companions were already mounted, and he swung himself onto his horse with fluid grace. As they rode away, Ellie watched until they disappeared into the gathering dusk. The street seemed somehow emptier without them, as if their presence had brought a vitality that was now gone. The crowd began to disperse, some heading into the saloon, others toward their homes for supper, but Ellie remained where she was, chained to the post, her situation unchanged despite the dramatic events of the evening. If anything, her position had become more precarious. She had been seen accepting help from an Indian, speaking in their defense, and challenging the town's authority. In the eyes of many, she had proven herself to be exactly the kind of dangerous radical they had always suspected. As full darkness fell over Broken Creek, Ellie closed her eyes and tried to find strength for whatever trials lay ahead. The night air was cooler, but it brought no real relief from her suffering. Her throat was parched again, her wrists were raw and bleeding, and exhaustion weighed on her like a physical burden. But somewhere in the darkness beyond the town, she knew that someone had seen her plight and had not turned away. Someone had risked his own safety to show her kindness. It was a small thing, perhaps, but in her current circumstances, it felt like everything. The night settled over Broken Creek like a suffocating blanket, bringing with it the sounds of a frontier town, winding down from the day's tensions. Oil lamps flickered to life in windows, casting golden squares of light onto the dusty street, while the piano in Murphy's saloon began its nightly serenade of off-key melodies and drunken laughter. Ellie had lost all feeling in her arms hours ago. The iron shackles had cut deep grooves into her wrists, and dried blood caked her forearms like rust-colored gloves. Her head lolled against the rough wooden post behind her, and she drifted in and out of consciousness, her body's desperate attempt to conserve what little strength remained. Through the haze of exhaustion and pain, she became aware of footsteps approaching. Slow, deliberate steps that belonged to someone trying not to be seen. She forced her eyes open and saw a small figure creeping along the shadows of the buildings. Mary Henderson, one of her former students. The girl was perhaps 12 years old, with corn silk hair and intelligent blue eyes that had always reminded Ellie of her own younger self. Mary had been one of her most promising pupils, absorbing knowledge with the hunger of someone who understood its value. Now she approached with the careful stealth of a child who knew she was breaking rules, but couldn't stop herself. "Miss Whitmore," Mary whispered, glancing nervously over her shoulder. "Are you awake?" Ellie tried to speak, but only managed a hoarse croak. Her throat felt like it was lined with sand, and her tongue seemed to have swollen to twice its normal size. Mary pulled a small cloth bundle from beneath her shawl. "I brought you some bread and water," she said, her voice barely audible. "Ma doesn't know I'm here. She'd tan my hide if she found out." The girl knelt beside Ellie and carefully held a tin cup to her lips. The water was warm and tasted of metal, but it was the most precious gift Ellie had ever received. She drank slowly, letting each drop ease the burning in her throat. "Thank you," she managed to whisper after drinking half the cup. "You're taking a terrible risk." Mary's young face was set with determination that belonged on someone much older. "You taught me that doing right is more important than doing safe," she said. "Besides, this isn't right what they're doing to you." The bread was stale and hard, but Ellie ate it gratefully, feeling strength slowly returning to her limbs. As she ate, Mary kept watch, her head turning at every sound from the street. "Is it true what they're saying?" the girl asked suddenly. "That you were teaching us things we shouldn't know?" Ellie considered her answer carefully. Even now chained and broken, she felt the weight of responsibility for this child's education. "I taught you to read everything," she said finally. "Not just what others wanted you to read. Is that wrong?" Mary shook her head firmly. "Pa says women don't need to understand business and laws and such, but I heard him talking to Mr. Murphy about selling our farm, and I could tell from his voice that he was scared. If I could read the papers he was talking about, maybe I could help." The simple statement broke Ellie's heart. Here was a child who wanted nothing more than to help her family, but was being denied the tools to do so simply because of her gender. It was exactly the kind of injustice that had driven Ellie to begin her evening classes in the first place. "Knowledge is never wrong," Ellie said, her voice gaining strength. The wrong is in keeping it from those who need it. A sound from the street made them both freeze. Heavy boots on the wooden sidewalk, moving with the unsteady gait of someone who had spent too much time in the saloon. Mary pressed herself against the building's wall, becoming one with the shadows. Frank Dalton emerged from Murphy's saloon, swaying slightly as he made his way toward the general store. He was a ranch hand with a reputation for meanness, especially when he'd been drinking. His eyes swept the street and came to rest on Ellie's huddled form. Well, he slurred, changing direction to approach her. "If it isn't our high and mighty schoolmarm, not feeling so superior now, are you?" Ellie said nothing, hoping he would lose interest and move on. But Dalton was in the mood for entertainment, and a helpless woman chained to a post was too tempting a target to ignore. "You know what your problem is?" he continued, squatting down in front of her. His breath reeked of whiskey and rotting teeth. "You forgot your place. Women are meant to serve, not to lead. Time you learned that lesson." He reached out and grabbed her chin roughly, forcing her to look at him. "Maybe after a few more days out here, you'll be ready to apologize proper-like. Maybe beg forgiveness for all the trouble you've caused." Mary pressed herself deeper into the shadows, her small fists clenched in helpless anger. Ellie could see the girl's face in the faint light from the saloon, and she prayed that Mary would stay hidden. The last thing she wanted was for her student to witness what might happen next. "Got nothing to say?" Dalton taunted, his grip tightening on her jaw. "Where's all that fancy talk now?" "Let her be, Frank." The voice came from the direction of the marshal's office, and Ellie felt a surge of relief as Deputy Morrison stepped into the circle of light cast by the saloon's windows. The lawman's hand rested casually on his gun butt, but his posture was anything but relaxed. Dalton released Ellie's chin and stood swaying slightly. "Just having a conversation, Morrison." "Nothing wrong with that, is there?" "Conversation's one thing," Morrison replied evenly. "Harassment's another. Move along." For a moment it looked like Dalton might argue. His hand drifted toward the knife on his belt, and his bloodshot eyes narrowed with drunken belligerence. But even through the whiskey haze, some part of his mind recognized that Morrison was faster, more experienced, and completely sober. "This ain't over," Dalton muttered, stumbling away into the darkness. Morrison waited until the ranch hand was out of sight before approaching Ellie. He knelt beside her, his weathered face creased with concern. "How are you holding up?" he asked quietly. "I've been better," Ellie replied, managing a weak smile. "Thank you for intervening." The deputy shook his head grimly. "Shouldn't have to. This whole thing's gotten out of hand." He glanced around to make sure they weren't being observed, then pulled a small flask from his coat. "Here, it's just water, but it's clean." As Ellie drank, Morrison continued speaking in low tones. "Word's getting around that you spoke up for those Indians today. Some folks are saying you're an Indian lover now on top of everything else." The implication was clear. Her situation had gone from bad to worse, and the deputy was trying to warn her without saying so directly. "What I am," Ellie said carefully, "is someone who believes in treating all people with dignity. If that makes me an Indian lover, so be it." Morrison studied her face in the dim light. "You've got more backbone than most men I know," he said finally. "But backbone won't stop a bullet or a rope." The harsh reality of her situation settled over Ellie like a physical weight. She was no longer just being punished for teaching women to read. She had crossed an even more dangerous line by showing sympathy for the Lakota. In a territory where Indian wars were still fresh in everyone's memory, that kind of sympathy could be seen as treason. "Is there any word from the territorial government?" she asked, grasping for hope. "Surely they won't allow this to continue indefinitely?" Morrison's expression grew even more grave. "Mayor Thorne sent a telegram this afternoon, claims you're a danger to public order, and requests permission to impose whatever punishment he sees fit." He paused, clearly reluctant to continue. "The response came back an hour ago. They're giving him a free hand." The words hit Ellie like a physical blow. She had been counting on intervention from higher authorities, some recognition that her treatment violated basic legal protections. But it seemed that in this remote corner of the territory, Mayor Thorne's word was law. "How long?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "The order says until you publicly recant your teachings and apologize for your behavior," Morrison replied. Or, he didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. Ellie understood the alternative. In frontier justice, some crimes were punished by exile, others by death. And in the current climate, with tensions running high between settlers and Indians, her supposed sympathy for the Lakota could easily be construed as the worst kind of treachery. From her hiding place in the shadows, Mary Henderson had heard every word. The girl's young mind struggled to process the implications, but she understood enough to know that her beloved teacher was in mortal danger. When Morrison finally left to continue his rounds, Mary crept closer again. "Miss Whitmore," she whispered urgently, "you have to do what they want. You have to apologize." Ellie looked at the girl's frightened face and felt her heart break a little more. How could she explain that some principles were worth dying for? How could she make a 12-year-old understand that surrendering now would betray everything she had tried to teach? "Mary," she said gently, "if I apologize for teaching you to read, what does that tell you about the value of your education?" The girl's eyes filled with tears. "It tells me that it's not worth your life," she said fiercely. The simple truth of it was overwhelming. Ellie closed her eyes and felt tears of her own begin to fall. In her darkest moment, surrounded by enemies and facing almost certain death, it was the love of a student that finally broke through her defenses. But even as her heart ached, her resolve remained unshaken. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests of her courage and convictions, and somewhere in the darkness beyond the town, she believed that help might be coming. Dawn crept across the Dakota Territory like a reluctant witness, painting the eastern sky in shades of pale gold and rose. Ellie had barely slept, drifting between consciousness and fevered dreams, where she walked free across endless prairies, only to wake and find herself still bound to the hitching post, her body racked with pain and exhaustion. The second day of her ordeal was beginning, and she could feel her strength ebbing like water from a cracked vessel. Her lips were cracked and bleeding, her throat burned with each shallow breath, and the iron shackles had rubbed her wrists raw to the bone. Yet somehow, through the haze of suffering, she maintained the fierce spark of defiance that had brought her to this place. As the sun climbed higher, the town of Broken Creek began to stir. Shopkeepers emerged to sweep their stoops, children ran past on their way to morning chores, and the smell of bacon and coffee drifted from kitchen windows. The mundane routines of frontier life continued around her, as if her suffering were merely part of the landscape. Mayor Thorne appeared in his office doorway, dressed in his best suit and looking remarkably pleased with himself. He surveyed the street with the satisfied air of a man who had successfully asserted his authority and expected no further challenges to his rule. "Morning, Miss Whitmore," he called out with false cheerfulness. "I trust you've had time to reconsider your position?" A simple apology would end all this unpleasantness. Ellie raised her head with great effort, her green eyes still blazing with undiminished spirit. "I have nothing to apologize for," she rasped, her voice barely audible but carrying clearly in the morning air. Thorne's satisfied expression darkened. "Stubborn to the end, I see. Well, we'll see how long that lasts." He turned and went back into his office, and Ellie heard the distinctive sound of a telegraph key beginning to tap out a message. Whatever he was communicating, she doubted it boded well for her future. As the morning progressed, more townspeople gathered to observe her continued punishment. Some watched with obvious discomfort, clearly troubled by the spectacle of a woman being slowly tortured to death in their midst. Others showed open satisfaction, as if her suffering somehow validated their worldview. Mrs. Agnes Murphy, Sean's wife, approached with a water bucket and dipper. She was a thin, nervous woman who rarely spoke above a whisper, perpetually cowed by her husband's domineering nature. "Please," Ellie whispered as the woman drew near. "Just a few drops." Mrs. Murphy glanced around nervously, then quickly ladled some water and held it to Ellie's lips. The blessed liquid was like heaven, and Ellie drank greedily until the dipper was empty. "Thank you," she breathed. Mrs. Murphy's eyes filled with tears. "This isn't right," she whispered so quietly that only Ellie could hear. "What they're doing to you isn't Christian." Before Ellie could respond, Sean Murphy's voice boomed across the street. "Agnes, get away from there!" The woman flinched as if struck and hurried away, leaving Ellie alone once more. But the brief moment of human kindness had strengthened her resolve. She was not forgotten, not abandoned completely. The sun climbed higher, promising another scorching day. Already the heat was becoming unbearable, and Ellie could feel her consciousness beginning to slip away again. She was dimly aware of voices around her, but they seemed to come from very far away. "She's dying," someone said. "Good riddance," came another voice. "One less troublemaker." "This has gone too far," a third voice protested. "We're not murderers." The debate swirled around her, but Ellie was beyond caring. She had entered a strange state where the pain seemed distant and unimportant. Her thoughts drifted to her childhood in Ohio, to the little schoolhouse where she had first discovered her love of teaching, to the faces of all the students she had guided toward literacy and knowledge. It was then that she heard the horses. The sound was different from the usual traffic, multiple riders moving fast, their hooves thundering against the hard-packed earth. Through her fading consciousness, she heard shouts of alarm from the townspeople. "Indians! They're coming back! Someone get the sheriff!" But Deputy Morrison's voice cut through the panic. "Hold your fire! They're carrying a white flag!" Ellie forced her eyes open and saw them. 3 riders approaching at full gallop, led by a figure she recognized even in her weakened state. Lakota rode in front, a strip of white cloth tied to a long pole held high above his head. Behind him came Chaitan and Matto, their faces grim with purpose. The riders pulled up in the center of the street, their horses snorting and pawing the ground. Dakota's dark eyes swept the gathered crowd before settling on Ellie's slumped form. What he saw there, the blood, the obvious dehydration, the way her head lolled against the post, transformed his expression into something terrible and beautiful. "I come to trade," he announced, his voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent street. Mayor Thorne emerged from his office, flanked by armed men. "We told you yesterday that your kind isn't welcome here," he called out. "Leave now before there's trouble." Lakota remained mounted, his bearing proud and uncompromising. "I come to trade," he repeated, "one life for another." "We don't trade with savages," Sean Murphy shouted from the saloon entrance. "Then you trade with a man," Lakota replied calmly. He dismounted in one fluid motion and walked toward the crowd, his hands visible and empty. "I offer myself in exchange for the woman, my life for her freedom." The proposition sent a ripple of excitement through the gathered townspeople. Here was something unprecedented, an Indian voluntarily surrendering himself to white justice. The implications were staggering. Mayor Thorne's eyes lit up with avarice. Having a Lakota prisoner would be a tremendous political coup, especially one who had defied white authority so boldly. It would cement his reputation as a strong leader and might even earn him recognition from the territorial government. "And why would we want you?" Thorne asked, trying to appear disinterested while his mind raced with possibilities. "Because I am Lakota, son of Chief Mahpia," the young warrior replied. "My capture would bring you more honor than the death of one white woman." The name meant nothing to most of the crowd, but Deputy Morrison's face went pale. Mahpia was indeed a respected Lakota leader, and the capture of his son would have significant political ramifications. It might also provoke exactly the kind of Indian war that everyone feared. "It's a trap," Frank Dalton called out, his voice thick with suspicion. "Soon as we let her go, his friends will come for him." Lakota turned to face his accuser. "My friends will not come," he said simply. "This is my choice, my honor. They understand." Chaitan spoke urgently in Lakota, clearly trying to dissuade his young companion from this course of action. But Lakota shook his head firmly and replied in the same language, his tone final and resolute. Ellie watched this exchange through a haze of pain and disbelief. This young man who barely knew her was offering to sacrifice his freedom, possibly his life, for hers. The magnitude of the gesture was overwhelming. "Don't," she whispered, though she doubted anyone could hear her. "Please don't." But Lakota had already made his decision. He approached Mayor Thorne with the measured pace of a man walking to his execution, his dignity intact despite the circumstances. "I offer fair trade," he said. "My life has value to you, hers has value to me. We exchange, and both sides honor the bargain." The crowd was buzzing with excitement and argument. Some saw the wisdom in the exchange. A live Indian prisoner was worth more than a dead white woman. Others smelled a trap and urged caution. Still others simply wanted to see violence regardless of the form it took. Mayor Thorne was clearly tempted, but he was also a politician who understood the importance of appearing to consider all angles. "What guarantee do we have that this isn't some elaborate rescue attempt?" he asked. In response, Lakota pulled a knife from his belt and laid it on the ground. Then he removed his tomahawk and placed it beside the knife. Finally, he took off his medicine bag and set it with the other items. "I come to you defenseless," he said. "My weapons, my spiritual protection, all offered freely. This is how my people show good faith." The gesture was clearly genuine, and even the most suspicious members of the crowd could see that he had placed himself completely at their mercy. Deputy Morrison stepped forward, clearly troubled by the implications of what was unfolding. "Mayor," he said quietly, "we need to think this through. Taking him prisoner could start a war, or it could prevent one," Thorne replied, his political instincts taking over. "Show them that we're not afraid, that we won't be intimidated by their presence." Lakota waited patiently as the debate continued around him. His eyes found Ellie's, and in that moment she saw something that took her breath away, not just compassion or heroism, but love. Somehow, in the span of a single day and night, this stranger had come to care for her enough to sacrifice everything. "Why?" she managed to whisper, though she knew he couldn't hear her from that distance. As if reading her thoughts, Dakota spoke loud enough for everyone to hear. "Because knowledge is sacred," he said, his words carrying the weight of absolute conviction. "Because those who share wisdom should be protected, not punished. Because this is what honor demands." The moment stretched like a bowstring drawn to its breaking point. Mayor Thorne stood frozen between political opportunity and the fear of consequences, while the crowd held its collective breath, sensing that history was being made in their small frontier town. Dakota remained motionless in the center of the street, his surrender complete, his fate hanging on the decision of men who saw him as less than human. Deputy Morrison stepped closer to the mayor, his voice urgent but low. "Cornelius, think about what you're doing. Chief Mapia has kept the peace for 3 years. You take his son prisoner, and that peace dies with it." But Thorne's eyes were already calculating the political benefits. A Lakota prisoner, especially one of such high status, would make headlines across the territory. It would establish him as a strong leader who wouldn't be intimidated by Indian threats. The gubernatorial appointment he'd been angling for suddenly seemed within reach. "The trade is acceptable," Thorne announced, his voice carrying across the silent street. "But there will be conditions." Dakota nodded once. "Name them." "You will be held in our jail until the territorial marshal arrives to transport you to Fort Abraham Lincoln for trial," Thorne said, his chest swelling with self-importance. "You will make no attempt to escape, and your people will make no attempt to rescue you." "And the woman goes free immediately?" Dakota asked, his dark eyes never leaving the mayor's face. "She goes free," Thorne confirmed. "Though she's no longer welcome in this town, she has 1 hour to gather her belongings and leave Broken Creek forever." The terms were harsh but not unexpected. Ellie would live, but she would lose everything she had built here, her school, her home, her students. Yet as she listened through the haze of pain and exhaustion, she felt only gratitude. This brave young man was giving her a second chance at life. Dakota walked slowly to where Ellie was chained, his movements deliberate and respectful. The crowd parted before him, uncertain how to react to this unprecedented situation. When he reached her, he knelt down and looked directly into her eyes. "This will hurt," he said softly, examining the iron shackles that had cut so deeply into her wrists. "But it will be over soon." He called out to Chayton, who dismounted and approached carrying a set of metal tools. The older man's face was grim with disapproval, but he handed over what appeared to be a small set of lockpicks and metal cutters that he had acquired from somewhere. "Where did you get those?" Deputy Morrison asked suspiciously. "Traded for them this morning," Dakota replied calmly as he began working on the first shackle. Sometimes the most valuable tools are the ones that set people free. The irony wasn't lost on anyone present. Here was an Indian using white man's tools to free a white woman from white man's chains. The symbolism was too powerful to ignore, and several members of the crowd shifted uncomfortably. The first shackle clicked open, and Ellie gasped as blood rushed back into her hand. The pain was excruciating, but it was also proof that she was still alive, still capable of healing. Dakota moved to the second shackle, his touch gentle despite the urgency of his task. "Why are you doing this?" Ellie whispered, her voice barely audible. Dakota paused in his work and met her eyes. "Because I have seen what happens when good people do nothing," he said quietly. "Because knowledge dies when those who carry it are silenced. Because you stood up for me when you had nothing to gain and everything to lose." The second shackle fell away, and Ellie collapsed forward, her body no longer supported by the iron bonds. Dakota caught her gently, his strong arms supporting her weight as she struggled to remain conscious. "Easy," he murmured. "You're free now." The words echoed across the silent street like a declaration of independence. She's free now. Simple words that carried the weight of justice finally served, of courage rewarded, of sacrifice given meaning. Deputy Morrison approached with a pair of iron manacles, his face apologetic but resolute. "I'm sorry," he said to Dakota, "but an agreement is an agreement." Dakota nodded and gently helped Ellie sit against the hitching post before standing to face his own imprisonment. He extended his hands without resistance, allowing Morrison to secure the shackles around his wrists. The metal clinked shut with a sound of finality that made several onlookers wince. "Take him to the jail," Mayor Thorne ordered, his voice loud and commanding. "Post guards around the clock. I want no mistakes." As Morrison led Dakota away, the young Lakota looked back over his shoulder one last time. His eyes found Ellie's and he smiled, not with sadness or regret, but with satisfaction. He had kept his promise. He had seen injustice and acted to correct it. Whatever happened to him now, he would face it with honor. The crowd began to disperse, the show over for now. But several people lingered, including Mary Henderson, who had been watching from the shadows since dawn. The girl ran to Ellie's side, tears streaming down her young face. "Miss Whitmore," she sobbed, "I thought you were going to die." Ellie managed a weak smile and reached out to touch the girl's cheek with her bloodied hand. "I'm alive, sweetheart, thanks to a very brave man." Mrs. Agnes Murphy approached hesitantly, carrying a blanket and a water jug. Her husband was nowhere to be seen, probably still in the saloon cursing the morning's events. She wrapped the blanket around Ellie's shoulders and held the water to her lips. "Can you stand?" she asked gently. "You need proper medical attention." With help from Mrs. Murphy and Mary, Ellie managed to get to her feet. Her legs were unsteady, and her head spun with the effort, but she was upright. She was free. The feeling was almost overwhelming after 36 hours of helpless captivity. "Where will you go?" Mary asked, her voice small and frightened. "You can't leave. Who will teach us?" The question cut deep. Ellie looked around at the faces of her former students and their mothers, women who had risked their husband's anger to attend her evening classes, children who had discovered the joy of reading under her guidance. Leaving them felt like abandoning her own children. "Knowledge doesn't live in one person," Ellie said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "It lives in all of us. What I taught you doesn't disappear just because I'm gone." She turned to face Mrs. Murphy, whose kindness had sustained her through the darkest hours. "You can read, can't you, Agnes?" The woman nodded nervously. "A little. My mother taught me before she died." "Then you can teach others," Ellie said firmly. "Not in a school, not openly, but quietly. In your homes, in the church basement, wherever you can gather safely. The knowledge is already inside you. You just need the courage to share it." Mrs. Murphy's eyes widened with fear and possibility. "I couldn't. I'm not smart enough, not brave enough." "You brought water to a dying woman knowing your husband would beat you if he found out," Ellie replied. "So that takes more courage than standing in front of a classroom." As word spread that Ellie was finally free, more people gathered. Some came out of curiosity, others to offer help, and a few to make sure she actually left town as promised. Dr. Samuel Hartwell, the town's only physician, pushed through the crowd with his medical bag. "Let me examine those wounds," he said brusquely, though his eyes were kind. He was an older man who had seen too much suffering to be shocked by political punishment, but professional enough to treat any patient who needed care. He cleaned and bandaged Ellie's wrists, clucking disapprovingly at the severity of the damage. "You'll have scars," he said bluntly. "And you need rest, food, and clean water. I'd recommend at least a week of bed rest, but I understand that's not possible under the circumstances." "I'll be fine," Ellie said, though her voice betrayed her exhaustion. "I just need to gather my things and find transportation out of town." "Already taken care of," came a familiar voice. Ellie turned to see Reverend Michael Collins approaching with his wagon. He was a thin, earnest man who had always supported her educational efforts, despite pressure from some of his parishioners to condemn them. "I'll take you to Rapid City," he said simply. "My sister lives there and she's always in need of a good teacher. The railroad reaches that far now, so you could continue west from there if you choose." The offer was more generous than Ellie had dared hope. Rapid City was large enough to offer opportunities and far enough away to be safe from Mayor Thorne's influence. It was a new beginning, a chance to rebuild. As they loaded her few belongings into the wagon, Mary Henderson pressed a small wrapped bundle into her hands. "It's bread and cheese," the girl said, "for the journey. And this." She handed Ellie a carefully folded piece of paper. "I wrote down everything I could remember from your lessons, so I won't forget." Ellie unfolded the paper and found pages of careful script, phonics rules, arithmetic principles, even quotes about the importance of education. It was proof that her work had not been in vain, that the seeds she had planted would continue to grow. "Keep learning," she whispered to Mary, "and when you're old enough, teach others." As the wagon pulled away from Broken Creek, Ellie looked back one last time at the town that had both embraced and rejected her. Her eyes found the jail where Lakota was being held, and she silently promised that his sacrifice would not be forgotten. Somehow, someday, she would find a way to honor what he had done. The sun was setting as they reached the first hill beyond town, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Behind them, the lights of Broken Creek began to twinkle in the gathering darkness. Ahead lay the unknown. New towns, new students, new opportunities to share the gift of knowledge. And somewhere in that vast territory, other teachers were lighting candles against the darkness. Other students were learning to read. Other voices were speaking truth to power. The work would continue, as it always had, as it always would. She was free now. They all were.